You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 52. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, first code experience, and their first job. Here in the podcast, we've decided not to have a sponsor. But if you want to support the podcast and the kinds of things that we do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at seanw.me/psauthor. We've had a little break in the podcast because we've had some internet problems. As most of you may know, we record the podcast over Skype. And what that means is that the internet's very important. In some of the recent cities, the internet just has not been good enough to get good audio. So we've taken a brief break. Starting with this episode, we'll be back to our twice-monthly schedule. Also, remember to follow us on Twitter at HWPod. We'll be announcing a new U.S. tour, including live podcast recordings. We'll be visiting 17 separate cities and visiting a local celebrity in each town to find out how they got started. On today's episode, I have Matt Pietrek. With over 25 years in the software industry, Matt Pietrek has had a quite interesting ride. Starting with Borland in the late 80s, during the head days of the Microsoft Borland compiler wars, he got his first intoxicating taste of OS internals, debuggers, and tools. From there, he spent a decade at Numega Technologies, working on seminal award-winning products like Bounce Checker and Soft Ice. Next was a 7-year stint at Microsoft, where he worked on Visual Studio Debugger and Profiler teams, Red Dog, now known as Azure, and Hyper-V. He currently works at SkyTap, a cloud computing company. Along the way, he's written several books on Windows internals, as well as numerous articles and columns for magazines such as MSJ, MSDN, PC Magazine, and Byte. When not slinging Python code or groveling through logs, Matt indulges in his passion for distilled spirits and cocktails. He's got a serious, ever-growing collection of rums and writes the Cocktail Wonk blog about his spirited adventures at cocktailwonk.com. Matt is one of those guys that I knew of from afar and really wanted to have a chance to meet him. Having him on the show has been a real treat. We got to dig into how he not only got started, but how that passion for understanding the software so close to the metal as he had to in doing things like the work at Numega and the debuggers and tool support he did at Borland. We also talk a bit about that ever-important decision of staying a developer versus becoming a manager, and he has some real insight there. Hopefully you're going to enjoy this one as much as I did recording it. Let's take a listen. Well, on today's podcast, we have someone I've been really excited to get to on the show. That's Matt Pietrek. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. It was a brighter, sunnier day here in Seattle, but it's starting to get a little overcast. But looking forward to doing some writing today and maybe going out for a run. So I can't complain.
That's awesome. And where do you work these days?
So I work at a company called SkyTap. When I joined them, you could legitimately have called them a startup, but they're over 100 people now, and just got another round of venture capital, and growing rapidly. I'm a software architect there, and I own various parts of the stack. The big one I own is sort of like wrangling with VMware. SkyTap is for the most part built on top of a large set of layers on top of various technologies, but one of the most critical ones is actually using VMware vSphere to spin up and run these VMs. And despite what VMware says, it's not that simple to make everything work the way you would like it to. And so it's sort of like I'm at the layer where the pedal hits the metal, and I'm constantly like, why did this VM not spin up? Or why is this network interface not connected? And why did it suspend here but not resume there? And so a lot of the technologies and a lot of the esoterics of CPU compatibility and features and stuff that I picked up from my prior 25 years, are still just as valuable today, even in the cloud. So.
Well, yeah, that's where I think of you. I think of you as pretty close to the metal. I knew you first as one of the Numega crowd.
Right. Exactly. And that was a totally fun crowd. I mean, people don't realize how much great talent there was there. I mean, obviously the the founders of Mega, Jim and Frank, good friends of mine, incredibly grateful for them to sort of, give me the opportunity when I was, basically 4 years out of college and only been in development for 2 years. But they were both geniuses, in their own right, essentially writing, one of the very first 386 virtual machines, I guess we call it today, but basically virtualizing DOS using the features of the 386. So those guys are brilliant in their own right and don't really get the credit that they deserve for that. And then there was me, John Robbins, Mark Rusinovich spent a while there, not as long as we had hoped, but he spent a while there. And God, I'm forgetting a couple other people, which is embarrassing. But yeah, there was a time in, basically like 94, 95, 96 where, we were winning awards for, bounce checker and soft ice. And it was just like a dream place to work. And there's so many people and it's like now we still get together, every once in a while we'll get together and just reminisce about like this was one of those like, what's the word I'm thinking of? Camelot kind of environment. So
I'm familiar with that whole process. So, because I think of you as sort of that pretty close to the metal, is that something that you toyed with early on? Did you have a first computer growing up, or where did that start?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of interesting. My very first computer was a TI-99 4A, and it was, I'm trying to remember exactly the sequence there, but it was a TI-99 4A, and I remember my mother, who knew nothing about computers, but just knew that I had some sort of aptitude for stuff. I remember like, God, man, it must have been Sears or someplace like that, but bought this computer, and then somehow we needed decided we needed some sort of printer for it, and so he found like some Olivetti typewriter or something, but I think it had one of the first ones that had like an RS-232 interface or something. And so somehow we managed to hook up this, this TI-99 4A with this Olivetti typewriter. So we sort of had a printer, and trying to think this would have been when I was like 15 or so. So probably right around 1980, 81, 82, somewhere in that era. Yeah. But, obviously there was no storage devices beyond a cassette drive. So, I have vivid memories of writing some very simple basic programs. I think I was writing, trying to write like blackjack and sort of like, using the RAND function to simulate, dice and stuff like that. Yeah. But I wrote some very simple programs, and I remember like, hey, if I can save this to, a cassette tape, and so I sort of like, stole my father's, big old black box tape recorder and hooked it up and was able to at least like save and reload my programs. So that was the first sort of computer I ever really worked with, and I sort of naturally gravitated towards it. But then I remember at some other point, I don't remember if it was before or after, but I desperately wanted an Atari 400 because like the Atari 800 was so expensive. Yeah. And I saved up my money, and it was like I had enough money, and I was like I wanted to go buy it. And my father, who I love him dearly, but he was like, oh, that's just a waste of money. I can't let you waste your money on that. And so I never got my Atari 400. But eventually, we got a Commodore 64, which, and believe it or not, there's a story here. We got a Commodore 64, and I sort of it was like my word processor for a number of years, and I never actually programmed, for some reason, the Commodore 64. But when I went away to college in 1984, I took it with me, and by that time we had a better printer, but I took it with me, and I wrote some like 10-page paper on something, and it was just about to save it, and the whole thing just crashed. I lost all my work. Wow. lost all my work. And, in a fit of fury, I sort of hit the keyboard rather hard, such that the Commodore 64 was no more. And I was like, well, okay, now I need another computer, and it's probably time for a real computer. So at the campus bookstore, I went to University of California at Santa Cruz. At the campus bookstore, they were starting to sell this brand new line of computers, the IBM PS2 series.
Oh wow!
It's like way back when, and again, not being rich at that point in time, all I could afford was the PS2 Model 25, and remember at the time, like the PS2 Model 80 was like the first like 386. Like that's what I really wanted, like that would have, led to untold, greatness. But I had the Model 25, which was the MCGA graphics, which nobody has ever used, and two floppy drives, and it came with Windows 1.03. So just sort of like seriously date myself there.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so I got this PS2 Model 25, and it was sort of like functioning as my sort of word processor. And then shortly thereafter, I took a class because I was majoring in physics, and I took a class, and it was like computational physics, and I was struggling, sort of like, writing some very simulation programs, simulating planets and the motion of planets. And I think there was also some like basic, like waves, like vibrational type of simulations.
Yeah.
And I remember at some point, like we started doing something with the Mandelbrot set, and I was like at the time, there was no 8087 on this. There was no math coprocessor, so it was slow to begin with. But then again, like to sort of like I was working with a pirated version of Turbo Pascal 3. I almost called it Delphi there, but a pirated copy of Turbo Pascal 3, which fit on like one floppy. But it only basically had the ability to set the graphics card into 320 by 200 mode, some incredibly low resolution.
Yeah.
And I'm like, these Mandelbrot sets are A, really slow, and B, like not very detailed, when you have this big clunky, 320 by 200 screen. And so somehow I had visited a bookstore, and I had found, I think it was a book called like Tom Hogan's Guide to the PC Architecture or something. And I had cracked it open and was like, okay, there's magic in here, and I just don't understand it.
Right.
But there was something about that desire to do better resolution graphics led me to understand that, hey, this computer actually had like a higher resolution, but that the Turbo Pascal just couldn't get me there, couldn't put it into that mode. And so I somehow stumbled across like interrupt 10, I think it's interrupt 10 hex, I think. No, it's interrupt 10 decimal. Anyhow, and I sort of like, and I realized that Turbo Pascal could actually call interrupts, and I sort of like put the pieces together, and was like, wait, if I do this, if I call this interrupt 10 and load these registers, I could put it into a higher resolution display, and then I can call interrupts to actually plot pixels. And for me, that was the aha moment. That was like, I'd say one of those transformative moments when I went from like, yeah, this is kind of an interesting side thing, when I'm focused on physics, to like, I love this. Like once it's sort of like unlocked, like there's this power there, and the more I learn, the more I can do. It became this sort of like all-encompassing thing. And I remember like months later, like all I want for Christmas is an 8087 math coprocessor, and it kind of grew from there.
What's interesting is I've heard similar stories like this, in that if you could have afforded the 386, this may have never happened, right? You would have had the better computer. And I always think about it as car mechanics. I've never had a good car mechanic that had a nice car, right? They always have a car that they can do their magic to make it do everything they want it to, but it's always got, rust in the quarter panel, and the carburetor sometimes has to, he has to pour gas directly in to get it started, and all that other sort of thing. And I think that sort of it starts that process in our brain that goes, this is a really neat puzzle, and I like puzzles.
I can apply myself to it.
Yeah.
And actually, you bring up a good point. Like, years prior, I had bought my first car, and I was certainly not a mechanic, but it was an old Buick, and it had a 350 engine, but it only had a 2-barrel carburetor. And I was like, I knew that there were like more powerful versions of this engine out there, and a big part of it is, they have a 4-barrel carburetor.
Yeah.
And, like, how can I upgrade this? And and I look back at it now, and I'm like, was I nuts? But I managed to go to a junkyard and found like a 4-barrel intake manifold for like $25, and then I tracked down, and somehow, and this was all pre-internet, pre-internet for like the masses. Somehow found somebody who was like parting out a car from the next year, but I was able to figure out that it was the same carburetor as the previous year, and so I bought a $15 4-barrel carburetor from the guy, and then it was obviously ancient, so it needed to be rebuilt. And then I went down to Kragen, and I found a rebuild kit. And I found a book on how to rebuild carburetors, and somehow I did this. Again, with literally having done no prior work on the car, other than maybe changing the oil, I somehow managed to replace the intake system on my '69 Buick.
Wow.
4-barrel from 2-barrel to a 4-barrel. And we actually and I could have completely botched this up, but I had a friend, or actually. A friend of our family who actually owned a garage shop, and after I completed this, we took it into him, and he kind of looked at it and said, "Damn, you didn't mess this up at all. I mean, it's other than maybe tuning the fuel mixture a little bit, you kind of did as good as my mechanics would have done." So it was sort of like that sort of desire to take things apart and then tinker with them and improve them was there early. So
you were always pretty close to the hardware.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if I see something, I want to take it apart.
Yeah.
I guess that's a common thing.
Absolutely.
So,
did you end up changing your major?
No, surprisingly, I think by the time I sort of truly discovered computational, or that I love computers, I was say probably halfway through my junior year. But I had some friends who were what they call it, computer CIS at the time, computer information sciences. And I remember they were talking about all these compiler classes and logic, and sort of logic transform states and stuff. And I'm like, this is not interesting to me, and years later, it's of course I'm sort of I backed into that, years later I can, intrinsically do this stuff. But at the time it looked like, this is sort of wonky academic stuff. This is not at all about programming the hardware. So no, I stayed the course with physics and figured okay, well, I'll get out and then, I'll go work for, Lockheed or Seagate or somebody like that. I'll end up in some sort of tech job in the Valley or whatever.
Yeah.
And of course, once I graduated, this is 1988. 88. Once I graduated, I kind of realized, a lot of those tech jobs actually need more. They need a master's degree or a PhD. So here I am with a bachelor's degree. And where the hell can I find a job? Who's going to take a chance on me?
Right.
And so again, way back in the days, you would scan a newspaper ads looking for jobs, and I came across an ad for Borland, and hey, we need tech support people. So
it's amazing how many developers start out in tech support. It seems to be an easy way into companies. And you were with Borland quite a while, weren't you? Before
I was there. So I was there for 4.5 years. I started out supporting, believe it or not, the guy who hired me, who I'm still friends with today via Facebook. He told me later, he's like, when we hired you, it's not like you knew, we would not have hired you based upon your experience or what you knew, but your enthusiasm was just so great. Sort of, I had taken in here's a program I wrote that basically scans a computer and basically inventories the hardware and tells you exactly what this computer is. And funny story, even then, like I wanted to take it over to like CompUSA and run on all their computers. I need more computers to run this on to make sure it works. And silly me, like I thought they would be happy to have me run it on their hardware, but no. Anyhow, I had this program I'd written, and I was so proud of it, so enthusiastic about it that the guy who ran tech support basically hired me anyhow. But I started out on Turbo Basic. And I think it was only a month or two into it that the manager came to me and said, and he was basically the manager of just the Turbo Basic support group, of which there were 3 of us. But he came to me and said, well, I got promoted. Now I'm manager of the whole department. And, well, I have been supporting this Turbo Assembler and Turbo Debugger product, but I'm too busy now. So you're going to have to support that as well.
Wow.
And so, I got thrown into the deep end really fast. Like suddenly I'm having to learn assembly language and debuggers, and like I was okay with BASIC, and Pascal, but I was certainly had not written anything resembling assembly language at that point.
Sure.
And so, it was very definitely one of those sink or swim kind of moments. But I sort of, oh my God, I love this. This is so cool. And at the time, again, very early in the sort of evolution of PCs, it was essentially you would have the people who were using that were the pretty hardcore people. People using our products were sort of the pioneers.
Sure.
And when something didn't work, they'd call support, and and 9 times out of 10, it was sort of like, well, your product's broken, and so the product's not working the way it's supposed to, or I don't think it's supposed to be doing this, and so. It sounds a little bad, but, our mission was to basically prove them wrong in the sense of they would say no, you're not understanding this, or here's what you're supposed to be doing. And so we truly had to understand our product, but also sort of the underlying technology. So, if they had an assembler bug, turbo assembler bug, and they're trying to say, well, it's not working the way it's supposed to, our first line of defense was to say no, you're not understanding this, and here's why. So we truly had to, understand, assembly language or the Pascal language or the C language or whatever it is you were supporting. We truly had to know it inside and out, to the point of there were times where we would sometimes start quoting, ANSI specifications back to the customer. So, it was very definitely a blood and guts, and you need to know everything here. And, and we got, I remember, I think my first month in, got a call from somebody who was writing his own, x86 virtual, emulator software. And here's me having supported an assembler for 2 months, and I'm trying to to keep up with him. So it was,
sure.
It was very much a trial by fire, but it truly forced me to understand everything.
Well, it's interesting because you got this job because of your enthusiasm, and obviously because probably he could see you were bright as well. And when I talk to companies about how they hire people, that is one of the things I sort of is part of my mantra is, finding good people. Skills aren't as important as the people are. You hire good people, you can always give them skills. You get me with skills that aren't good people, it's almost always a waste of time.
Right.
And so that enthusiasm, I think, is really important. I'm sure you didn't know because you were actually enthusiastic, but
yes, yeah.
And did you have mentors at that job that sort of, gave you a picture? Because, my impression always is, when you leave school, there's this sort of mix of fear and arrogance that a lot of, especially developers, tend to have.
Right.
And it's that first job that really becomes so informative. Someone takes them under their wing, or they learn how to learn, at the pace of business. Is that something that happened with you?
Yeah, definitely. There's actually too many to mention. But,
sure.
I remember, one guy in particular, it was sort of later in my Borland career, but a guy named Eli Bowling, who I still think today is still sort of like the head R&D guy at Embarcadero, but previously Borland.
Sure.
But But at the time, he was sort of like I think he was the junior linker developer, and he's only like a year or two ahead of me. But I remember talking with him about stuff, and I remember just like, oh, he really knows his stuff here. Like I thought I knew a certain amount coming into that, and then he's like the level beyond. But he was close enough to me in age to where he could like impart things to me, and I didn't feel like I'm bugging the guru type of thing.
Sure.
Tim, a guy named Eric Swenson, who's still out and about in industry, he was also brilliant. I think there was a whole group of folks who came from Gold Hill Software, which is way back in the day. And then, I worked with people like Chuck Jadsky, who, he was like basically a year ahead of me in support. He was the first support engineer at Borland to sort of like make the jump into research and development.
Interesting.
Chuck Jadsky has gone on, basically he's now, as far as I know, or at least for a number of years, like the head Delphi guy.
Oh, nice.
He was working side by side with Anders Heilsberg. And now, just the crazy thing with Borland is now I look back and there were certainly good people in support, but once it made the jump to the R&D side of things, there again, rocket scientists there. There was like Peter Kuckel's, compiler genius, and Anders Heilsberg. And I know I'm forgetting people. There's just like a whole mess of like insane talent at Borland in the early 90s, not just on the compiler, not just the language side of things, but also on the Quattro Pro and all those kind of things. Again, and I was eventually laid off in sort of one of those like early, like, hey, the economy's going to crap type of things. I was eventually laid off, mostly because I'm the most junior person, so probably like not yet carrying my, my true weight.
Sure.
But years later, I kind of realized like, wow, I had no idea how much was going on and how much was just going over my head at the time. But now that was just an incredible environment. And, I was very lucky as well. As there was, going back to something you said earlier about, support is, and these will connect together, is that while I was doing support, I remember getting into an online, basically Borland had online forums for CompuServe. I remember getting into sort of a debate, sort of like not quite antagonistic, but like a serious back and forth.
Yeah.
No, you don't know this, but with a guy named Andrew Schulman, who, this was Andrew Schulman pre undocumented Windows Andrew Schulman. But he had just started, working with Ray Duncan, and I think had done one of those, like the DOS extender book, one of Ray Duncan's books. Anyhow, Andrew Schulman and I sort of like got round and around on, sort of like arguing about some technical point of product, if I remember correctly. And at some point he's like, you really sort of like know what you're talking about here, and like I love your enthusiasm. Like, do you want to help me, help me author this book? And that was what became Undocumented Windows. Like he had an outline and he knew what he wanted to cover, but there were some topics that he just didn't have time to cover at that point.
Sure.
And I had some ideas of my own, and so through that time, sort of like while I was at Borland, my last sort of like 2 years at Borland, I started, working on, like doing writing. I got, started doing the work in Undocumented Windows, and had just, sort of started also breaking into MSJ magazine. So I had a few articles out. So I had just sort of broken into the writing thing, and that's when they laid me off.
But that may have... with all those things happening at once, it might have been the best thing for you, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I realized that years later that even though it sucked at the time,
sure.
It's like, I'm 4 years out of college and I'm just bought a condo and, struggling to pay the bills, and suddenly I'm unemployed. But it sort of having undocumented DOS and some other articles, it was enough, and plus sort of like the endorsement of Andrew Schulman, it was enough to sort of connect me up with Jim and Frank from Numega, such that, it was only a week or two after being laid off that Andrew sort of helped set me and Jim and Frank up together and talking, and they basically, after like 2 phone conversations, offered me a job.
Nice.
And the only catch is, I have to move across country, from California to New Hampshire.
Yeah, that was those were the 2 hotbeds at the time anyway.
Right.
Was the Bay Area and anything within driving distance of MIT.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a lot of, there was a ton of, not just MIT, but also digital was still sort of a big deal back then. So there's a ton of, I call them the ex-dechies, floating around in that area, and people like David Solomon, for example. And again, at the time, I didn't realize like how many sort of like seminal people were just sort of like hanging around and working at various jobs there, who had been like major technical contributors to the DEC operating systems, or who worked on like PDP-11s and all that kind of stuff, and a lot of that technology sort of evolved into NT.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was sort of the foundation for all of that. So a lot of people that don't even know digital or the PHP stuff is underneath most of everything that we work with every day, especially on the Windows side.
Right. Yeah. And so in that regard, I was very lucky. It just sort of lucked into, just being in the presence of some phenomenally smart, talented group at Borland, and then sort of like lucking again into meeting Andrew Schulman and, getting into writing, and then again, lucking into, New Mega and, that whole, that crowd, and so forth.
And do you feel like the writing scratches a different itch than the development?
It's interesting for me, like the writing, like I'd say, like I don't truly love, sitting down and like, cranking out a piece or whatever. But what it does for me is it forces me to think more critically about something. Like it helps me to make sure I truly understand something. So, if I'm like sort of like have a nebulous idea or just a basic idea, like I've written some code and it works, but but I don't truly understand it. Well, then I find if I have to write about it, it forces me to go back and, revalidate those assumptions and such. It's actually kind of, it's interesting is like having done all that writing, and the books are one thing, but like putting out a monthly column, where like every month you got to come up with a topic in like 2,000 words, and how do you make it interesting, and how do you keep at it, stay fresh. And after doing that for like 8 or 10 years, I sort of took a break from writing, and it's only sort of recently reemerged with like my writing about cocktails and spirits and stuff. But I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But it's the same. It's a similar thing. Is like I may be interested in something and using something and creating something, but writing is sort of where writing it down to where it's interesting to somebody else, and where I feel like I've explained it well. It's mostly furthering my own education. Sure,
because sometimes in order to write about it, you need to understand it way more than actually gets on the paper, and so that informs how you tell the ABC story. In some cases you need to know the whole alphabet.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I pride myself in. It's like when I think about what is it that I do, what's my skill, and a lot of times I think it's like I take complicated topics and sort of, I don't dumb them down, but I try to like simplify them such that I can explain them to somebody else. They can at least get a taste of what this other thing is, what this thing is. And then, if their own interests are such, they can go explore more on their own. But
so how long did it take you to figure that out? Because I think a lot of developers have these different sort of skill sets, right? I'm not talking about languages and platforms or anything, but the things that they're good at. Some people seem to drop into what they're good at very quickly, and some developers seem to, run with their hand in every pot, and it takes them a long time to figure that out.
Right. That's a good question. I think I think I was doing it for a number of years before I sort of realized that well, if I were to sum it up as, take complicated things and simplify them. I think I was doing that for a number of years without sort of thinking about it that way.
Sure.
But it was interesting. I had a conversation with Eric Trout at Microsoft. This was like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, but he was basically the director of kernel development, basically one level below, the John Devon and that sort of like the upper level of Windows, technical manager. Anyhow, and Eric's a brilliant, completely brilliant guy, one of the fathers of virtualization. But we were up in Whistler and sort of like a little retreat, and I was talking about Steve Sinofsky and some other executives, and he said like every person, everybody, like executive or person who's sort of like well respected, they have like some superpower. And he said, like, Steve Sinofsky's superpower is like he can just write forever. He can explain, like have a vision and explain it and just write about it and just like that's his superpower. And Bill Gates' superpower is he can just like read all the stuff. You can just read a phenomenal amount and digest it and act on it. But it made me sort of think about, well, what is my superpower in here? Sort of struck a chord with me, and it took me a while. And finally, it sort of dawned on me, like, that's what I like to do is take complicated things that have confused people and sort of like say, no, it's not that hard. Here it is, sort of in a nutshell.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
And as your career progressed, obviously through Numega and then Microsoft, and then after Microsoft, did you find that you had to make a decision about whether you were going to manage versus code, or architect versus management, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. At Microsoft, I dabbled in management when I was on what was at the time called the Red Dog team. Now it's Azure. I sort of dabbled in that. I had a small team that was like 2 other guys working with me. And then when I went to Hyper-V, I came in as a dev lead. I was a dev lead of, again, a fairly small team. I was manager of like 4 other devs, and it was basically the hypervisor, the hypervisor, like the innermost core of Hyper-V, but a team focused on like performance and stuff. And then subsequently during the reorg, Windows 8 reorg, all of a sudden, my manager's gone, replaced by another manager. Long story short, I ended up being the dev lead of the hypervisor itself, with like 8 people reporting to me. And I think it was a valuable lesson I've learned is that like if you're going to manage, you have to have technical respect of the people underneath you.
Yeah.
And coming in, like at the time, like I didn't know the Hyper-V architecture, and so I came in and I hadn't sort of like proven myself side by side along with these people, and suddenly I'm their manager. So it might have been a very different story, had I've been on the Hyper-V team for 3 years and I sort of rose to the manager. But like coming in, as an outsider and like having to, being the manager, but not having like been in the trenches all along with the other people, it became sort of it was a learning experience. Like, okay, I wouldn't do this again. Like, or I would, if I'm going to be a manager again, I have to sort of like have like worked in it myself. I have to be like the most knowledgeable or the expert or one of the experts before I jump in and say, I want to lead other people here. So like I've done it, I can do it again, but sort of through that sort of experience, I learned like, I just like the technology more. And so like at SkyTap, I'm like I have good relationships with like the technical leaders and like them, but I'm also quite happy to like let them go have the meetings and and create the complicated project management workflow stuff, and like just leave me to figure out how to make wrangle VMware into doing what we needed to do, and we each have our role, and I respect your role and you respect my role, and everything's good. So
everything's good.
Yeah.
And of course, that brings me to I don't know how new the love is, but I was looking at your website recently about the cocktails and
Oh,
spirits.
yes.
Are you
Yes.
actually venting, or is this mostly about making cocktails?
So this is well, I think of it as I like almost all parts of the spirits, of the spirits world, if you will. It's not just I'm not distilling, to answer the question briefly. I'm not distilling, although it certainly is an intriguing thing to me. I like, there's so many aspects to it. There's cocktails, like what's a good cocktail? There's history of the cocktails. There's spirits. There's what makes a good spirit? What are the types of spirits? How is Scotch different than bourbon? How is Pisco different than brandy? And what are the styles of rums? And then there's the whole, the distillation process, and there's just so many different areas, and then I throw in bars and travel and what makes a good bar and things just pretty much if you put spirits and cocktails in the center of it, anything that's related to it seems to be fascinating to me. And so the blog is my attempt at this is particularly interesting to me, and I'm just going to go wonk out on it. and somewhat the same way that I did with technology is an example I like to use is there's thousands of cocktails out there, with these interesting names like the daiquiri and the margarita and the whiskey sour. But at some point you realize they're the same basic idea. It's a little bit of something sour, something sweet, and then a spirit. And, you can basically start understanding these things. If you put a framework in place, you can understand, what these things are and not only improve your own understanding, but also maybe if you want to make your own cocktails, it provides a basis for exploring, rather than just having random recipes in your head. You're no, you have an idea of what the framework of a recipe is. And then now you can go do your own experimentation with it.
That is a very engineering view of the spirit world.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm also a spirit wonk as well. And that if there's a distillery anywhere nearby, I will hunt it down, and I will tour it, and I will ask questions, and I will worry about, is it a pot still? Is it a column still? What's in your mash bill? How long you barrel aging for? All that kind of stuff. So
that's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm actually working right now. It's somewhat under NDA, but it will be out in a few days. There's been some kind of a revolution in the science of understanding what goes into a distilled spirit. All the people think of it as there's a note of peach or a note of chocolate, or I get vanilla or grass or whatever, and the technology to actually sort of tear that apart and understand this flavor is coming from this compound, and this flavor is coming from this compound, and even more so, how can we control which compounds should be in there? There's been a revolution in that, and so I'm working on a sort of probably the wonkiest piece I've ever written. Where it's a long way from here's a really great here's a really great mezcal cocktail to me explaining in brief, here's what a gas chromatograph does, and here's a mass spectrometer chart of a 33-year-old aged rum. There's a big gap in there.
So are you going to get a gas chromatograph for the house? Is that the plan?
Don't think I haven't thought about it. But, my understanding is they're in about the $50,000 range.
Wow!
Wow! I would have to learn a lot more organic chemistry. But like I said, I have a good friend who owns a distillery, and it's a new distillery, but it's sort of shaking up the rum world with these are rums that are unlike anybody else has ever experienced, and he's nice enough to explain the science to me, and I get about a tenth of it, but it's still far more than you've ever seen out there in terms of explaining and understanding what's happening and what's in a rum.
Well, that's certainly an extension of everything you've ever done. I mean, this is it. I see this a lot when when people people are applying all these great skills they got, and they really kept in the software world for a long time. They had these skills of breaking things down and understanding and problem solving, and at some point it becomes, oh wow, these are actually like skills that apply everywhere. It's not just good debugging will help you fix your boiler as much as it will get your code to compile. Yeah
exactly. And it reminds me of, I don't know how true this is, but I've read that following the atomic bomb project, that a lot of those atomic scientists were like, well, what's next? And they sort of moved off into like I guess organic chemistry or some other sort of interesting topics, but like completely unrelated to nuclear physics.
Sure.
Like, here's the next thing for us to go, and dive.
That's wonderful.
And so like I said, like it's wonky, but it's not just like what I'm doing. It's not just like let's just microanalyze Jamaican rums, but it's also like the fun things I like to do of like we travel a lot. We try to make a couple international trips every year, and like when I do, it's like, okay, what are the bars need to go to? I sort of scientifically approach which bars are the most important here and have the most interesting things I want to try out, and then I plot them out on a map, and then I figure out when they're open, and I sort of like apply as like hyper planning to like how how can we do this the most optimal way possible. So like when we were just in London over the holidays, and we spent, I think I visited 15 bars in like 6 days. So
wow.
Yeah. Because it was like drives my wife a little nutty sometimes, but like when I want to do something, I get hyper focused on it.
I don't doubt that. Yeah. Well, it's been great having you on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time, especially on a Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, no, it's actually been fun.
Or actually Saturday morning your time, I guess. It's
Saturday
just
morning
about noon now. Yeah.
It's helped me procrastinate from going out and running.
Well, I don't want to be responsible for that.
Okay.
Well, you have a great day, and I appreciate you being on the show.
All right. Thanks much. I appreciate it much.
No worries.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast.